Sarah Matthews had given up on men entirely by the time she turned 32. It wasn't a sudden decision born from a single heartbreak, but rather a slow erosion of faith that had worn away at her soul like water against stone. 3 failed relationships, each one promising something different yet delivering the same painful ending, had taught her that trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. The last one had been the worst. Marcus had seemed perfect at first, attentive, ambitious, charming in all the right ways. He'd made her believe in second chances, convinced her that not all men would leave when things got difficult. But 6 months into their relationship, she discovered he'd been maintaining another life across town, complete with a fiancé who knew nothing about Sarah's existence. The betrayal hadn't just broken her heart, it had shattered something fundamental in how she viewed the world. Now, standing in the tiny apartment she'd moved into after that disaster, Sarah stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. The spark that had once lit her green eyes had dimmed to almost nothing. Her auburn hair, which she'd once taken pride in styling, hung limp around her shoulders. She'd stopped caring about appearances, stopped caring about much of anything beyond getting through each day without falling apart completely. Work had become her refuge and her prison. As a social worker in Denver, she threw herself into other people's problems, finding it easier to fix broken families than to acknowledge her own broken spirit. Her colleagues noticed the change but said nothing, respecting the walls she'd built around herself. She arrived early, stayed late, and volunteered for the most difficult cases, anything to avoid going home to an empty apartment and the echoing silence of her thoughts. Her sister Emily worried constantly, calling every few days with gentle suggestions that Sarah should try dating again, that she shouldn't let past experiences poison her future. But Sarah had heard enough empty promises to last a lifetime. She'd learned that men said whatever was necessary to get what they wanted, then disappeared like smoke when real commitment came knocking. She'd watched her mother go through the same cycle, falling for smooth talkers who always left eventually. The pattern was clear, and Sarah refused to be a victim of it anymore. The assignment came on a gray Tuesday morning in late September. Her supervisor, Janet, called her into the office with an expression that suggested this wouldn't be a routine case. Sarah sat down, clutching her coffee cup like a lifeline, and listened as Janet explained the situation. A group of Native American children from the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota had been displaced after a fire destroyed their community center, which had also served as temporary housing for families in crisis. The state needed someone to coordinate services and ensure the children's needs were being met while permanent solutions were arranged. Sarah's first instinct was to refuse. She was barely holding herself together in Denver. The thought of traveling to an unfamiliar place and dealing with an entirely new set of challenges felt overwhelming. But something in Janet's eyes stopped her from saying no immediately. Perhaps it was the unspoken plea for help, or maybe it was the tiny flicker of purpose that sparked somewhere deep inside her. The first real feeling she'd experienced in months that wasn't numbness or pain. Against her better judgment, Sarah agreed to take the assignment. She told herself it was just a job, just another case in a long line of cases. She'd drive up to South Dakota, do what needed to be done, and come home without getting emotionally involved. She'd perfected the art of professional distance, of caring enough to be effective but not enough to get hurt. This would be no different. As she packed her bag that evening, throwing practical clothes and work files into a worn duffel, Sarah had no idea she was about to meet someone who would challenge everything she'd convinced herself was true. She didn't know that her carefully constructed walls were about to face their greatest test, or that a Lakota chief with eyes like storm clouds and a heart full of ancient wisdom would see straight through her defenses to the wounded soul beneath. The drive to South Dakota stretched ahead of her, hundreds of miles of highway that would carry her toward a destiny she couldn't yet imagine. The Rosebud Reservation sprawled across the South Dakota landscape like a world unto itself, vast and humbling in its raw beauty. Sarah arrived just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson that seemed almost too vivid to be real. She'd expected something bleak and depressing, her mind colored by years of news reports about poverty and hardship on reservations. Instead, she found herself struck by an unexpected sense of peace that seemed to emanate from the land itself. The temporary shelter had been set up in the community school gymnasium, a sprawling space now filled with cots, donated supplies, and the quiet murmur of displaced families trying to make the best of a difficult situation. Sarah walked through the double doors carrying her clipboard and professional mask, ready to assess needs and create action plans. She'd done this dozens of times before in different contexts, and she told herself this was no different. But everything changed the moment she saw him. He stood near the far end of the gymnasium, surrounded by a group of elders and younger community members, his presence commanding attention without any apparent effort. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", with broad shoulders and long black hair pulled back in a traditional style. He wore jeans and a simple button-down shirt, nothing fancy, but he carried himself with a dignity that made Sarah think of warriors and wisdom keepers from another era. His face was all strong angles and weathered bronze skin that spoke of time spent outdoors, but it was his eyes that stopped her in her tracks, dark and deep, holding both profound sadness and unshakable strength in equal measure. Someone touched her elbow, and Sarah realized she'd been staring. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and silver-threaded hair introduced herself as Mary Little Thunder, one of the community organizers. She explained that the man Sarah had been watching was Chief Thomas White Eagle, the spiritual and community leader who'd been instrumental in coordinating the emergency response after the fire. Sarah forced herself to focus on the work at hand, moving through the shelter and conducting interviews with families, documenting needs and resources. But she remained hyper-aware of Chief White Eagle's presence, noticing when he knelt beside elderly residents to listen to their concerns, when he lifted small children onto his shoulders to make them laugh, when he spoke in Lakota to those who found comfort in their native language. There was something about the way he moved through the space that suggested he carried the weight of his entire community on his shoulders, yet somehow hadn't been crushed by it. Their first actual conversation happened almost by accident. Sarah was struggling with a folding table that had jammed, frustration mounting as she tried to force the mechanism to cooperate. Suddenly, strong hands appeared beside hers, and Chief White Eagle's calm voice said, "May I help?" Up close, he was even more imposing, but his demeanor remained gentle. Together they freed the stuck joint, and as Sarah set up her makeshift workstation, she felt his eyes on her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. She'd spent months perfecting her armor against male attention, but his gaze felt different, not predatory or calculating, but rather like he was seeing things she'd tried hard to hide. "You carry heavy burdens," he said quietly, the observation delivered without preamble or social niceties. His voice was deep and measured, each word chosen with care. "They show in the way you hold your shoulders, in the shadows behind your eyes. You are far from home in more ways than one." Sarah's immediate reaction was defensive anger. Who was this stranger to make such personal observations? She opened her mouth to deliver a cutting response, to put him in his place and re-establish the professional boundaries she desperately needed. But something in his expression stopped her. There was no judgment there, no manipulation or hidden agenda. Just a simple statement of truth delivered with compassion. Instead, she said stiffly, "I'm here to do a job, Chief White Eagle. I appreciate your help with the table, but I need to focus on my work." He nodded slowly, accepting her retreat without pushing. "Of course. But please know that if you need anything while you're here, you have only to ask. Our community may be struggling right now, but we take care of those who come to help us." Over the following days, Sarah found herself repeatedly in Chief White Eagle's orbit despite her best efforts to maintain distance. The reservation community was close-knit, and he seemed to be everywhere, mediating disputes, comforting the grieving, organizing volunteers, planning for the future. She watched him interact with his people and saw something she'd convinced herself didn't exist in men: genuine selflessness. He led by example rather than decree, often doing the hardest or dirtiest jobs himself before asking others to help. When supplies ran short, he ensured the elders and children were fed first, even if it meant he went without. When tempers flared in the stress of displacement, he listened to all sides with infinite patience before helping people find common ground. And through it all, he maintained a quiet strength that seemed unshakable. Sarah tried to dismiss what she was seeing, to find the cracks in his facade that would prove he was just like all the others. But the evidence kept mounting against her cynicism, creating a cognitive dissonance that left her unsettled and confused. The breaking point came on Sarah's 5th day at the reservation. She'd been working 18-hour shifts, channeling her discomfort and confusion into productivity, coordinating with state agencies and nonprofits to secure resources for the displaced families. Exhaustion had become her constant companion, and she welcomed it because it meant less time to think about the way Chief White Eagle's words had burrowed under her skin, less energy to analyze why his presence affected her so profoundly. She was working late in the small office the school had provided when the power suddenly failed, plunging the building into complete darkness. Sarah froze, her heart rate spiking as an irrational panic seized her. The darkness felt suffocating, bringing back unwanted memories of the night she'd discovered Marcus's betrayal, of sitting alone in her car outside his other fiancé's house, watching her entire understanding of reality collapse. A light appeared in the doorway, Chief White Eagle holding a battery-powered lantern, his face illuminated from below in a way that emphasized his strong features. "The generator has failed," he explained calmly. "The repair crew won't arrive until morning." You should not be here alone in the dark. Sarah wanted to insist she was fine, to send him away and prove she didn't need anyone's concern. But her voice came out shakier than intended when she said, "I just need to finish these reports." He stepped fully into the room, setting the lantern on her desk and pulling up a chair without asking permission. "The reports will wait. When did you last eat something that wasn't from a vending machine?" The question was so unexpected that Sarah actually laughed, though the sound came out bitter. "Is this how you lead, Chief? By mother-henning stubborn social workers who don't know when to quit?" His expression remained serious, but something warm flickered in his dark eyes. "This is how I honor the Creator's teaching that we are all connected, that your well-being matters as much as anyone else's in this community. You have been running yourself into the ground trying to help us. That is not sustainable, and it is not necessary." Sarah felt something crack inside her chest, a hairline fracture in the protective shell she'd built so carefully. "You don't know anything about me," she said, but the words lacked conviction. Chief White Eagle tilted his head, studying her in the lantern light with that unnerving perception she was beginning to recognize. "I know you are running from something. I know you believe that if you never stop moving, never let yourself feel, the pain cannot catch you. I know this because I have seen it before, in people who have been hurt so deeply they believe walls are the only way to survive." The accuracy of his words struck her like a physical blow. Sarah felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "And what if you're right?" she challenged. "What if walls are the only way to survive? What if trusting people just leads to more pain?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of his own experiences. 5 years ago, I lost my wife to cancer. She was 38 years old, the mother of our 2 daughters, the light of my life. For months after she passed, I built walls so high that even my own children could not reach me. I told myself that feeling nothing was better than feeling that terrible grief. Sarah found herself leaning forward despite her resistance, drawn into his story. "What changed?" "My youngest daughter, she was 8 at the time, she drew me a picture. It was of our family, but I was colored in black while everyone else was in bright colors. When I asked her why, she said it was because I had become a shadow, that the father she knew was gone. In that moment, I understood that by protecting myself from pain, I was also cutting myself off from love, from joy, from everything that makes life worth living." He paused, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "The walls did not protect me, Sarah. They imprisoned me. And I suspect they are doing the same to you." Hearing her name on his lips, spoken with such gentle certainty, shattered something fundamental in Sarah's defenses. The tears she'd been fighting finally broke through, streaming down her face as months of suppressed emotion came flooding out. She expected him to recoil, to be uncomfortable with her breakdown, the way men always were when faced with genuine feminine emotion. Instead, Chief White Eagle simply sat with her in the darkness, his presence a steady anchor as she wept. He didn't offer empty platitudes or try to fix her pain. He just remained, solid and unmoving, letting her grief and anger and fear wash through her until she was empty and exhausted. The days following Sarah's breakdown brought an unexpected shift in her relationship with Chief White Eagle and the entire reservation community. It was as if a moment of vulnerability had opened a door, allowing her to see and experience things she'd been too defended to notice before. She began to understand that what she'd initially perceived as professional detachment had actually been a prison of her own making. Chief White Eagle took it upon himself to share the teachings of his people with her, not in a formal or forced way, but organically, as they worked side by side coordinating relief efforts. One afternoon, while they were sorting donated clothing in the gymnasium, he told her about the Lakota concept of Mitakuya Oyasin, all my relations, the understanding that everything in creation is connected and interdependent. When you wall yourself off from others, he explained, folding a child's jacket with careful precision, you are not just protecting yourself from potential harm. You are severing your connection to the web of life, to the relationships that give existence meaning. In our way of thinking, this is a kind of spiritual death, a slow dying that happens while the body still walks. Sarah thought about this as she matched pairs of donated shoes, considering how isolated she'd become in Denver. She'd convinced herself that independence was strength, that needing no one meant no one could hurt her. But looking around the gymnasium at families supporting each other through crisis, at the elders sharing wisdom with the young, at the entire community coming together despite devastating loss, she began to question whether her version of strength was actually just another word for loneliness. Chief White Eagle seemed to sense the direction of her thoughts. "Strength is not the absence of vulnerability," he said quietly. True strength is having the courage to remain open-hearted even after your heart has been broken. This is one of the hardest teachings, and one I struggle with myself every day. Over the following week, Sarah found herself spending more time with Chief White Eagle beyond their coordination work. He invited her to share meals with his family, his 2 teenage daughters, Running Deer and Morning Star, who regarded their father with obvious adoration and treated Sarah with curious warmth. She watched how he parented with a combination of gentle guidance and firm boundaries, how he listened to his daughters' concerns with the same respectful attention he gave to the community elders. One evening, after a particularly good dinner prepared by Morning Star, the younger daughter asked Sarah directly, "Why are you so sad all the time? Even when you smile, your eyes don't smile with you." The blunt question, delivered with teenage directness and genuine concern, caught Sarah completely off guard. She looked to Chief White Eagle for rescue, but he simply watched her with calm interest, clearly believing his daughter's question deserved an honest answer. Sarah took a breath and decided on truth. "Because I trusted people who broke that trust, and I decided it was easier to be alone than to risk being hurt again." Running Deer, the older daughter at 16, exchanged a knowing look with her sister before speaking. "Our dad teaches us that pain is a part of life, but suffering is optional. Pain is what happens to you, but suffering is what you do with it. He says you can let it make you bitter and closed, or you can let it make you wiser and more compassionate." The wisdom in the young woman's words, clearly learned from her father but internalized and understood in her own way, struck Sarah deeply. She realized these girls, who had lost their mother at such tender ages, had somehow emerged from that tragedy with their hearts still open, still capable of trust and love. How had they managed what she could not? As if reading her thoughts, Chief White Eagle said, "They had no choice but to grieve and to heal, because they had each other and they had community. Grief shared is grief diminished. Pain witnessed by those who care for you loses some of its power to destroy." That night, lying in the small trailer that had been provided for her use, Sarah couldn't sleep. Her mind kept returning to everything she'd learned, everything she'd witnessed. She thought about the way Chief White Eagle had sat with her in the darkness without trying to fix her, the way his daughters had opened their home and hearts to a stranger despite their own losses, the way the entire community had responded to disaster not with despair but with determination and mutual support. She realized that her cynicism about men, about relationships, about trust itself, had been built on a foundation of incomplete data. She'd experienced betrayal and concluded that betrayal was inevitable, that all men were the same. But Chief White Eagle was not Marcus, was not any of the others who had let her down. He was his own person, shaped by his own values and culture and choices. The invitation came 2 weeks into Sarah's stay on the reservation. Chief White Eagle asked if she would like to participate in a traditional sweat lodge ceremony, explaining that it was a purification ritual designed to cleanse the body, mind, and spirit. Sarah's first instinct was to refuse, to maintain her role as an outside observer rather than a participant. But something had shifted in her during these past weeks, a curiosity about what healing might feel like if she allowed herself to be vulnerable enough to receive it. The ceremony took place at dawn in a special lodge constructed specifically for this purpose, away from the main settlement in a place where the prairie met a line of cottonwood trees. Chief White Eagle led the ceremony, his voice rising in traditional songs as heated stones were brought into the central pit, as sacred herbs were sprinkled to create cleansing smoke, as participants were invited to speak their prayers and intentions into the darkness. Inside the lodge, in the suffocating heat and complete blackness, Sarah felt her remaining defenses finally collapse. The physical discomfort forced her into the present moment, made it impossible to maintain the mental gymnastics she usually employed to avoid feeling. And in that space of forced presence, she finally allowed herself to grieve not just what had been done to her, but what she had done to herself by closing her heart so completely. She spoke into the darkness, her voice raw and broken, about betrayal and loss, about fear and anger, about the terrible loneliness of living behind walls. And from the darkness came responses, other voices sharing their own stories of pain and healing, of loss and resilience. Chief White Eagle's voice rose above the others, steady and strong, reminding everyone present that they were held by something larger than their individual suffering, that healing was not only possible but inevitable if they remained open to it. When they finally emerged from the lodge, Sarah felt scoured clean in a way she'd never experienced before. The morning sun seemed impossibly bright, the air impossibly fresh. She looked at Chief White Eagle, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time, not as a romantic prospect or a threat to her carefully maintained independence, but as a teacher, a healer, a man of profound integrity who had suffered his own losses yet somehow remained open-hearted and whole. Over the following days, as Sarah prepared to return to Denver, she found herself in long conversations with Chief White Eagle about life and faith and the courage required to remain vulnerable in a world that often rewarded cynicism. He never pushed her toward any particular conclusion, never suggested that his way was the only way. He simply offered his perspective, his experience, his hard-won wisdom, and trusted her to find her own path. On her last evening at the reservation, they walked together along the ridge overlooking the settlement, watching the sun paint the prairie in shades of amber and rose. Chief White Eagle spoke about the Lakota concept of good road, the idea that life's journey could be walked with honor and purpose regardless of what challenges arose. "You asked me once if walls were necessary for survival," he said, his eyes on the horizon. "What I have learned is that walls keep out not just pain but also possibility. Yes, if you open your heart again, you might be hurt. But you will also be capable of joy, of connection, of love. The question is not whether the risk exists, but whether a life without risk is really living at all." Sarah knew he was right. These weeks among the Lakota people had shown her an alternative to the isolated existence she'd created for herself. She'd witnessed men like Chief White Eagle who led with integrity, who prioritized community over ego, who remained strong while also remaining tender. She'd learned that her past experiences, however painful, didn't have to determine her future choices. When she finally drove away from the reservation, her car loaded with files and her heart full of gratitude, Sarah carried with her something she'd thought lost forever: hope. Not naive optimism that everything would be easy, but a deeper faith that goodness existed in the world, that trustworthy people could be found if she had the courage to remain open to finding them. She thought about Chief White Eagle, about his daughters, about the community that had welcomed her and taught her and helped her rediscover parts of herself she'd thought dead. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know if she'd ever return to South Dakota or maintain contact with the people who had transformed her understanding of what was possible. But she knew with absolute certainty that she was different now, that the woman driving back to Denver carried less armor and more authentic strength than the one who had made this journey weeks before. As the prairie gave way to highway, as the reservation faded in her rearview mirror, Sarah Matthews made a promise to herself. She would honor the teaching she'd received by living with an open heart, by remaining vulnerable even when it felt terrifying, by choosing faith over cynicism and connection over isolation. Chief White Eagle had restored her belief not just in good men, but in the possibility of healing, in the power of community, and in her own capacity to trust again. That was a gift beyond measure, and she would spend the rest of her life honoring it.